War of minds. Radio, film, and the birth of psychological warfare in World War II. World War II was not only a war of soldiers, tanks, and aircraft. It was also a war of voices, images, and ideas. While millions fought on battlefields across Europe, Africa, and Asia, another battle was taking place far from the front lines. It happened in homes, factories, schools, and cinemas. This battle was fought inside the human mind. For the first time in history, modern mass media became a weapon. Radio broadcasts and motion pictures were no longer just tools of entertainment or information. During World War II, they became instruments of psychological warfare designed to influence how people thought, felt, and believed. This chapter explores how radio and film transformed war itself, turning information into one of the most powerful weapons of the 20th century. Before the war, propaganda already existed. Governments had long used posters, newspapers, and speeches to shape public opinion, but these methods were limited. They were slow, local, and often reached only certain parts of society. By the late 1930s, the world had changed dramatically. Radio had entered everyday life. In many countries, families gathered around a single radio receiver each evening. Voices travelled instantly across cities, borders, and even continents. At the same time, cinema had become a shared cultural experience. Millions of people watched films every week, often seeing newsreels. Before the main movie, for the first time, governments could speak directly to entire nations at once. World War II would become the first truly global conflict where mass media was used systematically, strategically, and relentlessly as a weapon. Military and political leaders quickly understood a critical truth. Wars are not won by weapons alone. They are won by belief. A population that believes in victory will endure hardship, shortages, and loss. A population that loses hope may collapse even before its army is defeated. Psychological strength became just as important as military strength. This is where psychological warfare emerged. The goal was not only to defeat the enemy on the battlefield, but to control emotions: fear, confidence, anger, and loyalty. Radio and film were perfect tools for this purpose because they worked quietly and continuously, often without resistance. People trusted what they heard and saw. Radio was the most powerful medium of the war. Unlike newspapers, radio did not require literacy. Unlike cinema, it did not require people to leave their homes. A single broadcast could reach millions of listeners at the same moment. Governments invested heavily in national broadcasting systems. They created official radio stations, foreign language broadcasts, and even secret stations designed to sound like enemy voices. Some broadcasts told the truth. Others mixed facts with exaggeration or outright lies. Radio delivered speeches from political leaders, military updates, patriotic music, and emotional storytelling. It could calm a frightened population during air raids or stir anger against an enemy. Most importantly, radio created a sense of intimacy. Listeners felt as if the speaker was talking directly to them. A confident voice could reassure a nation. A calm tone could hide disaster. A passionate speech could turn fear into determination. The human voice became a weapon. Cinema played a different but equally important role. While radio reached individuals, film reached crowds. Cinemas were places where people gathered together, shared emotions, and absorbed messages as a group. Governments quickly realized that films could shape how entire societies understood the war. Film studios, directors, and actors were mobilized. Newsreels showed carefully selected images of the conflict victories, disciplined soldiers, and united civilians. Losses were minimized. Defeats were explained or ignored. Even fictional films carried political meaning. Heroes represented national ideals. Enemies were simplified, exaggerated, or dehumanized. Complex realities were turned into clear moral stories of good and evil. For many civilians, what they saw on the screen became their understanding of the war itself. Newsreels were especially influential. Before television, newsreels were the only way people could see moving images of the war. These short films were shown before feature movies and were presented as factual records of events. But what audiences saw was carefully controlled. Battles appeared organized and heroic. Soldiers looked confident and well-equipped. Civilian suffering was limited or framed as noble sacrifice. The chaos, fear, and brutality of real combat rarely appeared on screen. The result was a powerful illusion. The war shown in cinemas was not the war as it truly was, but it was the war people believed in. Propaganda was not always aggressive or obvious. Many radio programs and films were designed to educate rather than intimidate. They taught civilians how to conserve food, follow rationing rules, work longer hours, and support the war effort. Entertainment and instruction blended together. Music programs carried patriotic messages. Children's films taught loyalty and obedience. Documentaries explained why sacrifice was necessary. Often, audiences did not realize they were being influenced. That was the strength of psychological warfare. World war to force societies to confront difficult ethical questions. Is it acceptable for governments to control information during wartime? Is it justified to hide the truth to protect morale? Where does education end and manipulation begin? At the time, many leaders believed that propaganda was not only necessary, but essential. The fear of enemy influence justified censorship and strict control over media. In this environment, truth became fragile. Information was shaped, filtered, and weaponized. World War II was not just a clash of armies or ideologies. It was the first global war of the mind. Every major power used radio and film to influence its own population, its enemies, and neutral countries. Psychological warfare became a permanent part of modern conflict. The lessons learned during this war would shape politics, media, and communication for decades to come, and this was only the beginning. In the next chapter, we will examine how different nations built their propaganda systems, starting in Europe where radio towers, film studios, and broadcasting networks became as strategically important as factories and military bases. World War II proved one undeniable truth. To win the war, controlling weapons was not enough. You also had to control the story. Building the propaganda machine, how nations turn media into a weapon. By the time World War II began, propaganda was no longer improvised. It was planned, organized, and engineered. Governments did not simply use radio and film when it was convenient. They built entire systems around them. Ministries were created, budgets were approved, and experts were recruited. Writers, journalists, filmmakers, psychologists, and engineers all became part of a new kind of war effort. This chapter explores how different nations transformed mass media into a coordinated propaganda machine and why. Control of information became as important as control of territory. Across Europe, in the 1930s, many governments began to prepare for war long before the first shots were fired. They understood that modern conflict would require the support of entire populations. This meant unity. And unity required control of information. To achieve this, states centralized their media systems. Independent voices were gradually replaced or absorbed into official structures. Radio networks were nationalized or strictly regulated. Film production was supervised or directed by government agencies. The message needed to be clear, consistent, and repeated. Radio was usually the first priority. National broadcasting services expanded rapidly. Transmission power increased. New studios were built. Governments ensured that radio signals could reach even remote villages and border regions. At the same time, foreign language services were developed. These broadcasts were aimed at enemies, occupied territories, and neutral countries. The goal was not only to inform, but to influence, to shape how other nations perceived the war. Radio waves ignored borders, and that made them dangerous. To manage this power, governments created specialized propaganda offices. These agencies coordinated messaging across radio, film, newspapers, posters, and public events. Nothing was accidental. Every speech, broadcast, and image was part of a larger strategy. Messages were carefully tailored to different audiences. Civilians heard messages of unity and endurance. Soldiers heard messages of honor and duty. Enemies heard messages of doubt and fear. Neutral countries heard messages of legitimacy and moral justification. Psychological warfare became a science. Film propaganda required even more planning. Movies took time to produce, but their impact lasted longer. Governments identified cinema as a tool for shaping long-term beliefs rather than reacting to daily events. Film studios worked closely with military and political authorities. Scripts were reviewed, scenes were approved. Certain themes were encouraged, while others were forbidden. Heroes were created. Narratives were simplified. Complex political realities were reduced to clear moral choices. The goal was not realism, but persuasion. Newsreels played a central role in this system. They were presented as objective reports, but in reality, they were highly selective. Editors chose footage that supported the official narrative. Cameramen were sent where victories could be shown, and kept away from scenes of chaos or defeat. Timing was also important. A successful military operation might be shown repeatedly for weeks. A setback might be delayed, minimized, or reframed as a temporary difficulty. For the audience, repetition created belief. If something was shown often enough, it felt true. Censorship was another key element of the propaganda machine. Governments restricted what journalists could report. Letters from soldiers were monitored. Photographs from the front lines were reviewed. Casualty numbers were often controlled or delayed. This was not always presented as deception. Officials argued that censorship protected morale and prevented the enemy from gaining useful information. In many cases, the public is accepted, especially in times of crisis. Fear made people willing to trade truth for reassurance. Psychologists and social scientists were increasingly involved. They studied how people reacted to fear, hope, and authority. They analyzed which messages motivated cooperation and which created resistance. Propaganda based on audience response totally mattered. Messages that were too aggressive could cause skepticism. Messages that were too optimistic could lose credibility. The most effective propaganda felt reasonable, calm, and confident. It did not shout, it explained. One important technique was emotional framing. Rather than focusing on abstract political goals, propaganda emphasized personal stories: a worker in a factory, a mother waiting for her son, a soldier writing home. These stories created emotional connections between individuals and the larger war effort. Sacrifice became personal. Participation felt meaningful. War was no longer distant. It was intimate. Another powerful method was normalization. As the war continued, propaganda helped people accept new realities. Rationing, air raids, long working hours, and loss became part of daily life. Media messages framed these hardships as temporary, necessary, and shared by everyone. Suffering was presented as proof of commitment. Endurance became a moral duty. Not all propaganda relied on lies. Much of it used selective truth. Real events were reported, but context was controlled. Causes were simplified. Consequences were shaped. By choosing what to emphasize and what to ignore, governments guided interpretation without needing to fabricate entirely new stories. This made propaganda more believable and more dangerous. By the early years of World War II, propaganda systems were fully operational across much of the world. Radio towers, film studios, and information offices became strategic assets. Attacking them or protecting them was a military priority. The war of weapons and the war of words were now inseparable. Control the narrative, and you could influence behavior without force. The effects of these systems were profound. Entire populations were mobilized, Resistance was reduced, loyalty was reinforced. At the same time, independent thought became harder. Alternative perspectives were silenced or labeled as dangerous. Psychological warfare reshaped how societies understood truth itself. As the war progressed, these propaganda machines would be pushed even further. New techniques would emerge. Messages would become more aggressive, more sophisticated, and more targeted. In the next chapter, we will focus specifically on radio warfare. How broadcasts crossed borders, targeted enemy soldiers and civilians, and turned the invisible airwaves into a battlefield of voices. World War II had shown that winning modern wars required more than guns and tanks. It required control of information. And once that control existed, it would never fully disappear. The battle of voices. Radio warfare and the invisible front line. In World War II, some of the most intense battles were never seen. They had no explosions, no marching armies, and no visible front lines. Instead, they took place in the air carried by radio waves, crossing borders silently, entering homes, trenches, and prisoner camps. This was radio warfare. Unlike traditional weapons, radio could reach anyone with a receiver. It did not need permission. It did not respect borders. And once a message was heard, it could not be taken back. For the first time in history, nations fought a continuous war of voices. Radio warfare was built on a simple idea. If you could influence how people thought, you could influence how they acted. Broadcasts were designed not only to inform, but to persuade, confuse, intimidate, and demoralize. Some messages were subtle, others were direct and aggressive. Many were repeated day after day, slowly shaping perception. Radio became a psychological weapon aimed at both civilians and soldiers. One of the most important targets of radio warfare was morale. Morale was fragile. Soldiers far from home, civilians under bombardment, and workers facing shortages were all vulnerable to doubt. Radio messages sought to either strengthen that morale or destroy it. Friendly broadcasts emphasized unity, resilience, and inevitable victory. Enemy broadcasts attempted to highlight losses, exaggerate failures, and suggest that resistance was pointless. The goal was not immediate surrender. It was erosion. Radio had a unique advantage over other media. It felt personal. Listeners often heard the same voices every day. These voices became familiar, even trusted. Over time, the line between information and persuasion blurred. A calm, confident tone could make even false claims seem believable. A friendly voice speaking the listener's language could create doubt where none existed before. Radio did not shout from a distance. It whispered directly into the ear. Governments quickly realized that effective radio warfare required more than strong transmitters. It required credibility. This led to the development of different types of broadcasts. Some stations were openly official, clearly representing their governments. Others were disguised. These so-called black propaganda stations pretended to be independent, or even enemy, broadcasts. They used the enemy's language, music, and cultural references. They reported real news but twisted the interpretation. Small truths were mixed with subtle lies. The intention was to confuse listeners, not alarm them. If people could no longer trust what they heard, doubt would spread. Soldiers were a key audience. Radio broadcasts aimed at enemy troops focused on fear, fatigue, and isolation. They reminded soldiers how long the war had lasted, how far they were from home, and how uncertain their chances were. Messages spoke of loved ones suffering, of commanders making mistakes, of hopeless situations. Sometimes, broadcasters claimed that surrender would lead to humane treatment. Even when soldiers did not fully believe these messages, repeated exposure could weaken resolve. Doubt was a slow weapon. Civilians were another major target. Enemy broadcasts tried to undermine trust in governments. They questioned official reports. They highlighted bomb damage, shortages, and casualties. They suggested that leaders were lying or sacrificing ordinary people for their own ambitions. At the same time, Friendly broadcasts worked constantly to counter these messages. They reassured, they explained, they justified hardship. Radio became a battleground of competing narratives. Language played a critical role. Broadcasters carefully adjusted their tone and vocabulary depending on the audience. Messages aimed at foreign listeners avoided extreme language. They sounded reasonable, informed, and calm. The most effective propaganda did not insult, it sympathized. By acknowledging fear and suffering, broadcasters appeared honest. Once trust was established, persuasion became easier. Music was also a powerful tool. Patriotic songs reinforced national identity. Familiar melodies created comfort during uncertain times. In some broadcasts, popular enemy music was used to attract listeners. Before political messages were introduced, music lowered resistance. It made people stay tuned. Radio warfare was continuous. Unlike battles that ended when armies withdrew, broadcasts never stopped. Day and night, messages flowed across borders. Even during moments of silence on the battlefield, the war of voices continued. This constant presence shaped daily life. People planned routines around broadcasts. They listened for news, reassurance, or simply the sound of another human voice. In dark times, radio became part of survival. However, radio warfare had limits. Listeners were not passive. They compared messages with personal experience. If broadcasts contradicted reality too strongly, credibility collapsed. Effective radio propaganda required balance. Too much optimism sounded fake. Domaj. Fear caused resistance. The most successful messages stayed close to what people already believed, then pushed slightly further. Persuasion worked best when it felt natural. Governments also fought back technologically. They jammed enemy frequencies. They increased signal strength. They adjusted broadcast schedules to compete for attention. Radio warfare became a technical contest as well as a psychological one. Controlling the airwaves became a strategic priority. Radio towers were protected. Broadcasting facilities were guarded. Engineers became as valuable as soldiers. As the war progressed, radio warfare grew more sophisticated. Messages were tailored to specific regions, military units, and social groups. Broadcasters studied listener behavior and adapted their content accordingly. This marked a turning point. Psychological warfare was no longer improvised, it was systematic. By the later years of World War II, radio had proven its power. It could comfort or terrify. It could unite or divide. It could sustain a nation or weaken it from within. The invisible front line of radio warfare had become as real as any battlefield. In the next chapter, we will turn our attention to film propaganda, how cinema, newsreels, and fictional movies shaped public perception, created heroes and enemies, and transformed war into a carefully constructed visual story. While radio spoke to the mind, film spoke to the eye, and what people saw, they remembered. The agais screen. Cinema, newsreels, and the visual language of propaganda. If radio dominated the air, cinema dominated the eye. During World War II, moving images became one of the most powerful tools for shaping how people understood the conflict. Film did not merely describe the war, it defined it. What people saw on the screen became their mental picture of reality. Cinema had a unique advantage over other forms of media. It combined sound, image, music, and storytelling into a single experience. More importantly, it was a shared experience. People watched films together, reacted together, and often left the theatre with the same emotions and conclusions. This made cinema an ideal weapon for psychological warfare. Before the war, cinema was already a major cultural force. Millions attended movie theatres each week. Newsreels were a regular part of the experience, providing short visual updates about the world before the main film began. When war arrived, governments moved quickly. Film studios were placed under supervision. Directors and writers were guided or restricted. Newsreel production was reorganized to serve national goals. In many countries, cinema became a strategic industry. The camera was no longer neutral. It had a mission. Newsreels were the backbone of wartime film propaganda. They appeared factual, authoritative, and immediate. For many civilians, they were the only moving images of the war they would ever see. What appeared in newsreels shaped public understanding of events far more than written reports, but newsreels were carefully constructed. Footage was selected to show strength, unity, and progress. Victories were highlighted. Losses were minimized or reframed. Scenes of chaos, fear, or failure were rarely shown. The war on screen was organized, and purposeful even, when reality was not. Timing played a crucial role. Newsreels were not always shown immediately after events occurred. Editors waited for the right moment, the right framing, and the right narrative. A battle might be presented days or weeks later, once its meaning could be controlled. By the time audiences saw the images, interpretation had already been decided. The camera did not simply record history, it interpreted it. Beyond newsreels, fictional films carried even greater influence. War movies, dramas, and comedies all played roles in shaping public perception. These films did not need to be realistic to be effective. Their purpose was emotional rather than factual. Heroes embodied national ideals: courage, loyalty, sacrifice. Enemies were simplified, exaggerated, or turned into symbols rather than individuals. Moral ambiguity was reduced to clear distinctions between right and wrong. These stories helped audiences make sense of a complex and frightening world. Film allowed governments to humanize the war effort. Instead of abstract strategies and distant battles, movies focused on individuals. A young soldier leaving home, a family waiting anxiously for news, a factory worker contributing to the front lines through labor. By personalizing the war, cinema made participation feel meaningful. Sacrifice was no longer anonymous, it had a face. Visual symbolism was used extensively. Uniforms, flags, and familiar landscapes reinforced national identity. Music underscored emotional moments, guiding audience reactions. Lighting and camera angles shaped how characters were perceived: strong, heroic, threatening, or weak. These techniques worked subconsciously. Viewers felt more than they analyzed. Cinema also helped normalize war. Repeated exposure to military imagery made conflict feel routine. Audiences grew accustomed to seeing weapons, uniforms, and destruction on screen. This reduced shock and helped people adapt psychologically to prolonged violence. At the same time, film framed suffering as noble and necessary. Hardship became proof of commitment. Loss became evidence of purpose. Children were not excluded. Animated films and family-friendly stories carried simplified messages about loyalty, bravery, and duty. These films avoided graphic violence, but clearly defined heroes and enemies. Early exposure shaped long-term attitudes. Propaganda was not only about the present, it was about the future. Cinema also played a role in international perception. Films were exported to allied and neutral countries. They presented a carefully constructed image of national strength, moral legitimacy, and cultural values. Winning the support, or at least the sympathy of foreign audiences, became a strategic goal. Film crossed borders more easily than armies, and it left lasting impressions. Despite its power, film propaganda faced challenges. Producing high-quality movies required time, resources, and skilled personnel. Audiences could also become skeptical if messages felt repetitive or unrealistic. As the war dragged on, maintaining credibility became increasingly difficult. Effective propaganda required balance. Too much optimism felt dishonest. Too much realism risked damaging morale. Successful films walked a narrow line between truth and persuasion. The influence of wartime cinema extended beyond the war itself. Techniques developed during World War II would shape post-war filmmaking, advertising, and political communication. The language of visual persuasion became a permanent part of modern society. Began as wartime necessity became peacetime practice. By the end of the conflict, cinema had proven that controlling images could shape memory, belief, and identity on a massive scale. People might forget radio broadcasts, but they remembered what they saw. In the next chapter, we will explore how propaganda targeted emotions directly: fear, hope, hatred, and empathy, and how psychological techniques were refined to influence behavior without force. World War II was teaching governments a lasting lesson. If you could control emotion, you could control action, emotion as a weapon. Fear, hope, hatred, and the psychology of war. World War II revealed a powerful truth about human behavior. People do not make decisions based on facts alone. They act based on emotions. Fear, hope, anger, pride, and empathy shape how individuals understand the world. During the war, governments learned to target these emotions deliberately. Psychological warfare was no longer only about information. It was about emotional control. This chapter explores how emotions became weapons and how media was used to trigger them. Fear was one of the most effective tools. Fear could motivate action, enforce obedience, and suppress dissent. At the same time, fear could also paralyze, confuse, and exhaust. Propaganda had to manage fear carefully. Radio broadcasts and films warned civilians of danger while offering reassurance. They emphasized threats from the enemy, but also promised protection. Through unity and discipline, the message was clear. The world is dangerous, but we are safe together. Enemy propaganda used fear differently. Instead of offering protection, it emphasized vulnerability. Broadcasts highlighted bombings, shortages, and military losses. They questioned the ability of leaders to defend their people. The goal was not panic, it was doubt. If fear could be separated from trust, morale would weaken. Hope was the counterbalance. No population could endure prolonged hardship without believing in a future reward. Propaganda constantly projected images of eventual victory, peace, and reconstruction. These images did not need to be detailed. They needed to feel possible. Radio speeches promised that suffering had meaning. Films showed imagined futures where sacrifice was remembered and honored. Victory was always near even when it was not. Hope kept people moving forward. Hatred was used to simplify the enemy. War is complex. Hatred makes it simple. Propaganda reduced entire nations to symbols of evil. Enemy leaders were portrayed as monsters. Enemy soldiers were shown as cruel, dishonest, or inferior. These portrayals removed moral ambiguity. If the enemy was evil, then violence became justified. Hatred reduced empathy. However, hatred had to be controlled. Excessive hatred could lead to uncontrolled violence or undermine discipline. Propaganda therefore framed hatred as righteous rather than emotional. It was presented as moral clarity, not rage. The enemy deserved defeat, not chaos. This distinction allowed societies to maintain internal order while supporting external aggression. Empathy was also carefully manipulated. Propaganda encouraged empathy towards certain groups while denying it to others. Civilians were shown stories of suffering, but only on one side. Friendly victims were humanized. Enemy victims were ignored or justified. This selective empathy shaped moral boundaries. People learned who deserved compassion and who did not. Personal stories were especially powerful. Abstract numbers did not move emotions. Individuals did. Films and radio programs focused on families, children, workers, and soldiers. These stories created emotional identification. When audiences recognized themselves in these characters, propaganda became personal. The war was no longer distant. It was emotional. Guilt was another psychological tool. Propaganda reminded civilians that soldiers were sacrificing their lives. This created a sense of obligation. Working harder, accepting rationing, and remaining silent became moral duties To complain was to betray. Guilt enforced compliance without force. Pride was equally important. National pride transformed endurance into honor. Media celebrated resilience, productivity, and unity. Ordinary actions were framed as heroic contributions to the war effort. Working became fighting. Enduring became winning. Pride replaced exhaustion. Shame was used quietly. Dissent, criticism, and doubt were portrayed as weakness or selfishness. Propaganda rarely attacked dissenters directly. Instead, it isolated them socially. No one wanted to be seen as unpatriotic. Social pressure became psychological control. Repetition strengthened emotional conditioning. The same themes appeared again and again. Fear of the enemy, hope for victory, pride in sacrifice. Over time, these emotions became automatic responses rather than conscious. Reactions media did not argue, it conditioned. Importantly, propaganda avoided emotional extremes. Messages that were too frightening caused panic. Messages that were too optimistic felt dishonest. Effective emotional warfare stayed close to lived experience, then subtly guided interpretation. This made propaganda feel realistic, and therefore trustworthy. As the war dragged on, emotional fatigue became a challenge. People grew tired of fear and promises. Propaganda adapted by shifting tonal excitement, body reassurance. Calm voices replaced dramatic ones. Stability became the goal. Psychological warfare evolved with circumstance. World War II demonstrated that emotional influence could mobilize entire societies. People endured shortages, danger, and loss not only because they were forced to, but because they believed, felt, and identified. Emotion had become a strategic resource. In the next chapter, we will examine black propaganda and deception, how lies, false identities, and manipulated truth were used to confuse enemies and destabilize societies from within. Psychological warfare was not always honest. Sometimes it was invisible. The war of lies, deception, black propaganda, and psychological manipulation. Not all propaganda during World War II was visible. Some of the most powerful psychological weapons operated in the shadows. They did not announce their origin. They did not carry national symbols. Instead, they hid behind false identities, half-truths, and carefully constructed illusions. This was black propaganda. Unlike official broadcasts and films, black propaganda pretended to come from sources that did not exist or from the enemy itself. Its purpose was not to inspire loyalty, but to confuse, divide, and erode trust. This chapter explores how deception became a weapon of war. At its core, black propaganda relied on credibility. If listeners believed a message came from a trusted source, they were more likely to accept it. Governments therefore created fake radio stations, underground newspapers, and anonymous pamphlets that appeared independent or oppositional. These sources spoke the language of doubt. They criticized leaders. They questioned strategy. They echoed common frustrations. The goal was not immediate belief. It was gradual erosion. Radio was the ideal medium for deception. Listeners could not see who was speaking. A familiar accent, a believable tone, and accurate cultural references were often enough to establish authenticity. Many black propaganda broadcasts mixed real news with subtle distortion. This made detection difficult. When lies were hidden among truths, skepticism weakened. One common technique was exaggeration rather than invention. Instead of creating false events, black propaganda emphasized real problem shortages, casualties, delays, and framed them as signs of incompetence or betrayal. These messages did not need to convince listeners of new facts. They only needed to reinterpret existing ones. Another method was impersonation. Broadcasters pretended to be disillusioned citizens, soldiers, or officials. They spoke as insiders who had seen the truth. This created intimacy and trust. Listeners felt they were hearing forbidden knowledge. Secrecy increased credibility. Rumor was a powerful weapon. Black propaganda often relied on suggestion rather than direct accusation. Questions were posed instead of statements. Doubt was planted without offering answers. Why are supplies always delayed? Why are certain units sent into danger repeatedly? Why are leaders silent about recent losses? Rumors spread faster than facts. Once doubt existed, it multiplied on its own. Black propaganda also targeted relationships. Messages attempted to create suspicion between soldiers and commanders, civilians and governments, allies and partners. Minor disagreements were exaggerated. Miscommunications were framed as betrayal. Trust was the target. A divided society was easier to weaken. Deception extended beyond radio. Fake letters were distributed. Forged documents were leaked. Counterfeit newspapers were dropped behind enemy lines. Each item appeared authentic, familiar and routine. Nothing looked like propaganda. That was the point. The effectiveness of black propaganda depended on timing. Messages were most powerful during moments of crisis after defeats, during shortages, or when leadership appeared uncertain. In these moments, people were already searching for explanations. Black propaganda provided them. Often, it simply confirmed existing fears. However, deception carried risks. If false sources were exposed, trust collapsed instantly. Audiences became suspicious not only of the fake messages, but of all information including genuine news. This could backfire. Too much deception weakened the entire information environment. Governments responded by increasing counterintelligence and media monitoring. They warned citizens about enemy broadcasts. They published lists of trusted stations. They encouraged skepticism, ironically, teaching people to doubt information itself. This created a new problem. When everyone was warned about lies, truth became harder to identify. Black propaganda raised serious ethical questions. Was it acceptable to lie deliberately to civilians? Could deception be justified if it shortened the war? Did psychological manipulation violate moral boundaries? During World War II, most governments answered these questions pragmatically. Victory came first. The long-term consequences were significant. Black propaganda contributed to a culture of suspicion. After the war, many societies struggled with distrust toward media and authority. The line between information and manipulation remained blurred. The War of Lies did not end in 1945. It evolved. World War II demonstrated that deception could weaken enemies without firing a shot. It also showed that once trust is damaged, it is difficult to restore. Psychological warfare was effective but costly. In the next chapter, we will explore how propaganda targeted occupied and neutral populations, shaping loyalty, resistance, and collaboration. The War of Minds was not limited to the front lines. It followed people everywhere occupied minds. Propaganda in occupied lands and neutral nations. When armies crossed borders during World War II, the war did not end with military occupation. In many ways, it had only begun. Controlling territory was one challenge. Controlling the population was another. Occupied lands and neutral nations became critical battlegrounds in the psychological war. Winning loyalty, preventing resistance, and shaping perception were essential to maintaining power without constant force. This chapter explores how propaganda was used to manage minds where weapons alone were not enough. In occupied territories, fear was immediate. Military presence was visible. Authority was imposed. But fear alone could not ensure long-term control. Occupying powers needed cooperation from workers, administrators, and civilians. Propaganda became a tool to normalize occupation. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, posters, and films presented occupation as temporary, orderly, or even beneficial. Messages emphasized stability, economic opportunity, and protection from chaos. The goal was acceptance. Language was carefully chosen. Occupation propaganda avoided harsh commands. Instead, it used calm, administrative tones. Words like order, reconstruction, and security replaced violence and coercion. The occupation was framed as necessary management, rather than domination. Reality was softened. Local collaboration was essential. Occupying authorities promoted local figures who appeared cooperative. These individuals were presented as mediators, protecting local interests while working within the new system. Propaganda emphasized continuity. Life goes on. Work continues. Normality returns. This reduced the psychological shock of defeat. At the same time, resistance movements were targeted aggressively. Propaganda portrayed resistance fighters as criminals, extremists, or irresponsible agitators. Their actions were framed as causes of suffering rather than acts of courage. Violence against civilians was blamed on resistance, not occupation. Responsibility was redirected. Hajjupledge, central role in occupied territories. Broadcasts were often bilingual, mixing official language with local dialects. This created familiarity. Music, cultural references, and local news were included to maintain attention. Political messages were subtle. Over time, repetition created emotional fatigue, weakening resistance to persuasion. Education was another key front. Schools were reorganized. Textbooks were revised. History was reframed to support the occupier's narrative. Children were taught new interpretations of identity, loyalty, and authority. Long-term control required, shaping the next generation. Propaganda looked to the future. Neutral countries were different but equally important. Neutrality did not mean isolation. Neutral nations were information hubs. Their media influenced international opinion. Their economic and diplomatic decisions affected the war's balance. Both sides competed intensely for their attention. Propaganda aimed at neutral countries emphasized legitimacy. Each side portrayed itself as defensive, lawful, and morally justified. Enemy actions were framed as aggressive or illegal. Messages avoided extreme language to maintain credibility. Neutral audiences were skeptical. Persuasion had to be careful. Cultural diplomacy became a form of propaganda. Films, exhibitions, music, and literature were exported to neutral nations. These cultural products presented an image of sophistication, stability, and moral clarity. Winning admiration became a strategic goal. Respect translated into influence. Economic messaging was also important. Propaganda highlighted trade opportunities, economic stability, and future partnerships. Neutral nations were encouraged to see alignment as beneficial rather than dangerous. Fear was replaced with calculation. In both occupied and neutral territories, propaganda focused on choice. Support cooperation, and life remains stable. Support resistance, and chaos follows. Message was rarely spoken directly. It was implied. However, propaganda in these environments faced constant resistance. Occupied populations compared messages with lived reality. Neutral nations compared competing narratives. Credibility remained fragile. The more visible the gap between message and experience, the weaker propaganda became. Underground media emerged in response. Illegal radio listening, secret newspapers, and word-of-mouth networks spread alternative narratives. These forms of resistance kept doubt alive and prevented total psychological domination. Control was never absolute. World War II demonstrated that occupation was as much psychological as military. Force could conquer land. Only persuasion or exhaustion could control people. In the next chapter, we will explore how propaganda affected soldiers, directly from recruitment and training to morale, discipline, and surrender. The battlefield did not end at the front line. It followed soldiers in too. Their thoughts, soldiers' minds, propaganda at the front line. For soldiers in World War II, the battlefield was not only physical, it was psychological. Far from home, surrounded by danger, exhaustion, and uncertainty, soldiers were uniquely vulnerable to influence. Governments understood this. Propaganda aimed at soldiers was designed to shape how they understood their mission, their enemy, and themselves. This chapter examines how psychological warfare followed soldiers to the front. lines and into their thoughts. Before soldiers ever reached combat, propaganda had already shaped them. Recruitment posters, training films, and patriotic speeches created expectations. War was framed as necessary, meaningful, and honorable. Training reinforced discipline and obedience, while minimizing doubt. By the time soldiers faced the enemy, many already carried a mental narrative. They knew why they were fighting. Or at least, they believed they did. At the front, maintaining morale became critical. Combat exhausted the body and the mind. Fear, boredom, and trauma threatened cohesion. Propaganda sought to stabilize emotions and reinforce purpose. Military radio broadcasts, newsletters, and films were distributed near the front lines. Messages emphasized unity, shared hardship, and progress even when progress was slow. The goal was endurance. Leadership played a psychological role. Commanders were portrayed as competent and caring. Media emphasized that. Déchaînes, word with soldiers leaves in mind. Failures were framed as unavoidable or temporary. Trust in leadership reduced questioning. Questioning reduced obedience. Propaganda also helped soldiers cope with fear. Fear was acknowledged but controlled. Messages emphasized training, camaraderie, and professionalism. Soldiers were encouraged to see fear as natural, but manageable. Courage was framed not as fearlessness, but as discipline under pressure. This reframing allowed soldiers to function. The enemy was carefully portrayed. Enemy soldiers were often shown as aggressive, dishonest, or dangerous. This reduced hesitation in combat. At the same time, propaganda avoided portraying the enemy as invincible. The enemy was dangerous but defeatable. Balance mattered. Propaganda also targeted soldiers emotionally. Stories from home were emphasized. Letters, radio messages, and films reminded soldiers what they were fighting for. Family, freedom, and future were recurring themes. This emotional connection strengthened resolve. The war was personal. However, enemy propaganda also reached the front lines. Radio broadcasts targeted soldiers directly. Messages highlighted casualties, poor conditions, and length of service. They questioned leadership decisions and suggested abandonment or betrayal. Some broadcasts offered promises of fair treatment upon surrender. These messages were not always believed, but they planted doubt. Psychological warfare aimed at. Soldiers rarely sought immediate surrender. It aimed to weaken confidence, gradually. Fatigue made soldiers more receptive. Prolonged exposure increased impact. Even skepticism required energy. Doubt grew quietly. Prisoners of war were another focus. Propaganda, aimed at captured soldiers, emphasized humane treatment, cooperation, and ideological messages. The goal was compliance and, in some cases, conversion. Captured soldiers became both audiences and tools. Their testimonies could be reused. Rumors played a significant role at the front. Information traveled, informally, between units. Stories spread quickly, often without verification. Propaganda exploited this by encouraging certain narratives. Rumors were difficult to control. They bypassed official channels. Propaganda also shaped how soldiers understood death. Fallen comrades were portrayed as heroes. Death was framed as sacrifice rather than loss. This helped soldiers cope with grief and continue fighting. Meaning reduced despair. As the war continued, psychological fatigue became a major challenge. Messages adapted. Donisov and less emphasis was placed on excitement and more on endurance and survival. Stability became the focus. Propaganda evolved with the soldiers' experience. World War II demonstrated that soldiers were not machines. They were human. Their performance depended on belief, trust, and emotional resilience. Psychological warfare recognized this reality and exploited it. In the next chapter, we will examine the long-term consequences of wartime propaganda, how it shaped memory, identity, and post-war societies. The war would end. The psychological impact would not, after the war. Memory, media, and the psychological legacy. When World War II ended, The fighting stopped. But the psychological war did not. Nations emerged from the conflict physically damaged, economically exhausted, and emotionally transformed. The weapons of propaganda radio, film, narrative. Control did not disappear with peace. They remained embedded in institutions, habits, and collective memory. This chapter explores how wartime propaganda shaped the post-war world. During the war, media had not only reported events, it had defined them. Years of controlled narratives influenced how societies remembered victory, defeat, and sacrifice. Certain stories were emphasized, others were forgotten. Memory itself became selective. What people remembered was not always what had happened. It was what had been shown. Governments faced a new challenge after the war. They needed to transition from mobilization to reconstruction. Media messaging shifted tone. Urgency was replaced with stability. Unity was reframed as healing. Yet, the methods remained familiar. Centralized messaging, selective emphasis, emotional framing. Propaganda evolved rather than ended. War films continued to shape memory. Post-war cinema revisited the conflict through heroic, tragic, or moral lenses. These films helped societies process trauma, but they also reinforced national narratives. Some stories were celebrated, others were avoided. Cinema became a tool of remembrance and forgetting. Radio also retained influence. Broadcasts commemorated anniversaries, honored veterans, and reinforced official interpretations of the war. These programs shaped how younger generations understood events they had never experienced. Memory was taught, not discovered. Education systems reflected wartime narratives. Textbooks simplified complex events. Moral clarity replaced ambiguity. National perspectives dominated. Psychological warfare had trained societies to prefer clear stories over difficult truths. This comforted. It also limited understanding. For individuals, the effects were deeply personal. Veterans carried psychological scars shaped by both experience and narrative. Civilians struggled to reconcile propaganda with reality. Trust in institutions varied widely. Some accepted official histories, others questioned them. The war also changed how media was perceived. People became more aware yet also more vulnerable to manipulation. The experience of propaganda created skepticism, but it also normalized information control. Media power was understood and feared. Internationally, wartime propaganda shaped post-war politics. Narratives of liberation, sacrifice, and moral authority influenced diplomatic relationships. Former enemies remembered different wars. Former allies emphasized different victories. Memory became political. The techniques of World War II propaganda influenced later conflicts. Cold War messaging, political campaigns, advertising, and modern information warfare all borrowed from wartime practices. Emotional framing, repetition, and selective truth became standard tools. The psychological battlefield expanded. World War II taught governments that controlling weapons was not enough. Controlling meaning mattered more. The war ended, but the struggle over narrative continued. In the final chapter, we will reflect on what World War II teaches us today about media, truth, and the responsibility that comes with powerful communication tools. The War of Minds is not history, it is ongoing. The lessons of psychological warfare, media, truth, and the responsibility of communication. World War II ended in 1945. Millions of lives had been lost. Cities were destroyed. Economies lay in ruins. But beyond the physical devastation, the war left another legacy, one that persists today: the power of the mind as a battlefield. From radio waves to the silver screen, from leaflets to propaganda posters, governments had learned a profound lesson. Controlling information can be as decisive as controlling territory. This final chapter reflects on those lessons. The first lesson is the power of narrative. Information alone is insufficient. Facts do not move people without context, emotion, and interpretation. During World War II, The stories that accompanied events, the speeches, the films, the images were carefully curated. They shaped how millions perceived reality. Narratives can unify or divide, inspire or demoralize. They are weapons, whether wielded consciously or unconsciously. The second lesson is the centrality of emotion. Fear, hope, pride, and anger were not side effects, they were targets. Propaganda worked because it addressed human psychology directly. By acknowledging what people felt and shaping their interpretation of it, leaders could influence behavior far more effectively than with force alone. Emotional resonance amplifies information. It creates action. The third lesson is the importance of credibility. The most effective propaganda in World War II was believable. Messages that aligned partially with truth were far more persuasive than outright falsehoods. Black propaganda, carefully disguised and interwoven with real events, demonstrated that subtlety often surpasses force. Trust is fragile once lost. It cannot easily be restored. The fourth lesson is the lasting impact of controlled memory. Wartime messaging did not disappear when peace arrived. Societies continued to interpret history through the lens shaped by propaganda. Collective memory, national identity, and post-war policy were all influenced by what people were shown, told, and allowed to see. Information shapes the future, not just the present. The fifth lesson is responsibility in communication. World War II illustrates that media, in its many forms, carries immense power. Words, images, and sounds can save lives or manipulate millions. Governments, journalists, and creators all bear responsibility for how their work influences perception. In the wrong hands, media becomes a tool of coercion. In responsible hands, it can educate, warn, and inspire. They were also demonstrated the limits of control. Despite carefully orchestrated propaganda, human agency remained resilient. Rumors, underground networks, resistance, and personal experience often countered official narratives. Propaganda could shape thought, but it could not fully dominate it. Freedom of thought endures, even in extreme circumstances. Today, the lessons of World War II remain relevant. Modern societies face new forms of psychological warfare through television, social media, and digital platforms. Algorithms, targeted content, and misinformation campaigns echo techniques first refined during the global conflict of the 1940s. Understanding history helps us recognize influence. It equips us to question, analyze, and respond. World War II showed that war is not fought only with weapons, strategy, or geography. It is fought in the mind. Victory depends on morale, perception, belief, and trust. Those who control information can shape events, for good or ill. Finally, World War II reminds us of a human truth. Every story matters, every image matters, every word matters. Propaganda is not just history, it is a warning. The war of minds is ongoing. The responsibility to understand it is ours.